Hi, in this video we are going to create our first Azure Virtual Desktop artifacts. And therefore we set the corresponding work item to active, and it's this one here. And then we are about to launch our pipeline. But before we are going to do that, just make sure that your domain controller is up and running, because our desktops are doing a domain join, and therefore we need the domain controller to be up and running. So go to your pipelines and select the corresponding or the correct pipeline to run, which is this guy here. And you only need to specify a user account that is able to do a domain join. And for easy purpose, I use the domain administrator for doing that. So the pipeline is about to launch. So what's happening in here? Let's have a look at the code of this Azure DevOps pipeline. And therefore I'm navigating back and click on the edit button here and look at the code, and the code is written in YAML. YAML is a markup language that should be easier to read for humans. However, for Azure DevOps, you still need some practice. We have different sections, one parameter section, for example, to ask the user, the variable section to specify which variables to use, the pool specify which operating system should be used for the build agent, and then we have the stages that compile or different tasks. And the build phase, for example, is compiled with tasks to publish together all the artifacts that I need later on for the deployment, and to publish it on a certain directory so that it can be uploaded to the build agent. And then the deployment phase is much more interesting, because I'm executing an Azure Cli task or a script code here. For example, like create the resource groups if they have not been created. And the next thing is to do a deployment via the Azure Cli. And the Azure Cli deployment job takes usually a lot of parameters. And one could be the template file, or one is the template file that is basically an ARM template. But in my case, it's an Azure Bicep file. Azure Bicep is a new technology, and it's easier to use and easier to read than ARM templates. ARM templates are JSON files, which are a little bit more difficult to read, and especially when it comes to nested deployments, like you have one deployment calling another sub-deployment, then ARM templates are not so handy. And that's a little bit easier to do with Azure Bicep file. So right now we are looking at the guts of our pipeline here, which is the AVD complete bicep file. It looks like some small program code. You have parameters and you have some modules that more or less look like function definitions, right? But these are actually the sub-deployments. And so the modules are just another bicep files, which are groupings of Azure resources that you are going to, or that you want from Azure to be deployed in a certain order. Right, so you have the resources. For example, I create a resource hostpool. I also create a network security group, for example, here, or a network card for a virtual machine. And these are the Azure resources defined in an Azure Bicep file. So that's basically what is being executed in that Azure Cli task. And so we have looked into the YAML pipeline, what is being executed here. And now let's look at the Azure side. On the Azure side, how the deployment looks like on that end. So I'm doing some sort of split screening here, looking into the resource group that the deployments is targeting. And it's in this very pipeline we are going against the HP1 resource group. And you could see then if you go to the deployment section that the bicep file is executing multiple deployments at a time, so which a top deployment which is triggering some sub deployments, and currently we are looking at the one that is creating the session hosts or the desktop, the virtual machines that are going to be presented to my users. And as this takes a while, I'll speed that up for saving some time. So at this stage, the join domain has been accomplished. So let's verify that. Looking at the domain tools and see if these computer accounts have been generated. They are not in the computers group. They are sorted in the host pool organizational unit. Here they are. Perfect. Good. The next step is the registration at the host pools. So the host pool has been created, the Azure Virtual Desktop host pool. But we see there are no virtual machines or no desktops, no session hosts joined to that host pool, right? And that's happening in that very phase when the desired state extension on top is being executed in the desktops. It will bring the installation of the Azure Virtual Desktop agents, and once they have registered at the host pools, these virtual machines or these desktops will show up as valid session hosts in the host pool. So that takes a while, therefore I speeded it up to save you some time. So the agent installation went green. So let's have a look at the host pool right now. We see the two virtual machines or the two session hosts are there. However, they are still marked as unavailable, but that's okay for now. During the deployment, be patient here. That takes a while until these guys show up in green here. However, let's wait for the rest of the deployment. Let's go to the resource group again and see there have been quite some things being created. Let's take a look at the master deployment, which just finished now. So we created the host pool, the application group. We did some other things with the application group. And now also a workspace has been created. So if we look to our Azure Virtual Desktop artifacts here, you see them in the bottom. You can start administering Azure Virtual Desktop using the built-in control plane. For doing so, you see the host pool is here, which is, let's open that one. Now our session hosts went to green. You could see the agent version at the back. Right, we have an application group that is being created. So an application group is, specifying which users can access the desktop. So there's an assignment to a user group or to individual users you could add at the bottom or at the top here, which is a directory picker. So all the synchronized accounts you should find here. And the last thing is a workspace. So Workspace is a grouping of or gathering of application groups. Currently I have only this guy here, this single application group representing the desktop access. And access is my next task. I'm trying to access this desktop using a client. And there are various clients out there for Azure Virtual Desktop. I'm using that guy here for and downloaded it, and now I'm connecting as a user to the currently or new published desktop. So let me log on as Azure Virtual Desktop user 1, and if you're not quite sure which user principal name to use, look at your Azure Active Directory and go into the user section here, and in my case, it's bfranktest.onmicrosoft.com. As password, that's the same as your domain admin has, if you haven't changed anything. So let's connect And if everything worked out, you should see your session desktop here. So how does these fit together? Well, you have a workspace. In the workspace, you have application groups, and also onto these application groups, you have permissions to as this kind of user. And now you can, sort of customize the experience a little bit what the user sees using that workspace, right? I customize the default behavior by right-clicking on the session desktop and changing the view type to single monitor. And then I double-click on the desktop icon and log on with my known password. And this is doing a Kerberos logon onto that box. I speeded up the logon process a bit. Yeah, voila. This is my first Azure Virtual Desktop deployed using Azure DevOps pipeline. And if you have a look at the operating system version which is being used, you see here the Enterprise for Virtual Desktop license, which is the multi-session Windows 10 with a pre-installed Office, and also with Teams already installed on that virtual machine. Finally, set the task or the user story to resolved. Ta-da! Mission completed.